Yes, we
I'm
can
just
hear you clearly.
going. So a quick overview of what I'm going to discuss. First, a brief history and overview of the interchange fee regulation, and highlight some of the more recent issues that we are confronted with. I will then talk about the report that the Commission prepared on the application of the IFR. I will then very briefly present recent developments in the payment sector in the union. Let's call this a industry perspective. And finally, I will explain the next steps in terms of IFR and more broadly in terms of payment legislation. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the interchange fee regulation was entered into force in 8th of June 2015. However, most of its provisions produced effects in a staggered fashion, and I will explain this in a minute. The IFR concerns card-based transactions within the EEA, and the caps that the IFR imposes on interchange fees actually apply only to consumer cards. And IFR is the part of the union's payment package together with the PSD2. The IFR has several provisions, notably the articles on the interchange fees, which became mandatory only in December 2016. And then the so-called business rules that prescribe behavior to market participants were effective on June of 2000. And why I'm mentioning all this, I will clarify in a minute, because this refers to the Commission prepared on the application of the IFR. If we can move to the next slide, please. To the next slide. As I said, I just want to highlight for the audience a few of the more topical issues that we're confronted with. As some of you may know, we have Article 7.1 of the IFR, which requires card schemes to separate their processing entities in order to, the idea here is to allow competition to increase in providing of processing services. The regulatory technical standards that prescribe how this separation should take place were published only in January 2018. In February 2018, at the same time, we had a European Court of Justice judgment clarifying that the IFR caps apply also to three-party schemes that work with the co-branding partner or agent. And finally, just to submit to your attention that the assessing of the so-called convention caps, which is prescribed in Article 5 of the IFR, it's a very data-intensive exercise requiring case-by-case analysis, and this is being conducted by the national enforcement agencies in each member state. If we can move to the next slide. So, yes, so as some may know, Article 17 of the IFR to the Council a report on the application of the IFR, and which is to be accompanied, if appropriate, and I highlighted there the word if appropriate, by a legislative proposal. So for the reason that I presented until now, the limited time since the application of certain IFR provisions, RTS is entered into force only in 2018, the Commission submitted the final report in June this year, basically. And in the meantime, there was a very comprehensive study that was conducted on behalf of the Commission by an external partner, which collected a significant amount of information that the Commission used in order to inform the report. This study was published only in February this year, and the contractor approached more than 5,000 participants in the payment market, and to ask them for information, which was then subsequently used to process the study and present the conclusions. If we can move to the next slide. So what does the report that the Commission submitted in June this year says? What are the main conclusions? Well, basically, it concludes that the main objectives of the IFR have been reached. Notably, interchange fees have declined across the board in the EEA, and the main beneficiaries for this decline were actually the merchants, who have seen savings of to the tune of 1.2 billion euro for every year since the entry into force of the IFR. And as probably most people in the audience know, interchange fees are now leveled for consumer cars. So we're talking about interchange fees for cars are basically the level of the IFR caps all across the EU. It's a harmonization that was produced. And finally, IFR also to have stimulated cross-border activities, notably in relation to acquiring services. We can move to the next slide, please. So at the same time, the report also identified a number of areas where further monitoring and collection of more information is required, notably the assessment of circumvention that we have already mentioned. In particular, what appears to be a significant increase in scheme fees in the recent years. So that's something that national authorities in charge with the application of the IFR have to look into. And the application of the IFR caps in situations where the card schemes, mainly three-party schemes, but also four-party schemes, enter co-branding arrangements with the commercial partners. And finally, the report identified areas where simply because the time of implementation was too short, it's not possible to draw definitive conclusions. And some of these areas I've already mentioned. It's the requirement to card scheme to separate their processing entities, and also the assessment of long-term contracts. This refers to the situation that some merchants and some acquirers enter long-term contracts for their fee, and this takes time in order to adjust to the levels that were triggered by the IFR. So for all these reasons, has not submitted a proposal for a legislative review stage of submitting the report to the Parliament. There's also an additional reason, and this has to do with the market dynamics. And we will talk about this in the next slide. If we can move to the next slide. So taking an eagle-eye view of how the payment sector does in the Union 5 years after the entry into force of the IFR, I would hope that all the people in the audience would agree that we can say that it's a very dynamic sector, and there are some people who say that there were things happening in this sector in the last 3-4 years that were more significant than what happened in the last 30 years in payment. Now, I don't know if that's fully correct, but it is indeed a very dynamic sector. What we can note, however, is that to date we don't have a genuine pan-European car scheme that would be in position to challenge major players in the industry. However, there's an interesting initiative that was recently announced. I think most of you have heard of that. European Payment Initiative. It's an initiative of some 16 European banks, and it's probably it looks as a very interesting development. There are a number of recent new smaller players, regional players, which entered the payments arena, but they have a very good prospect to develop for cross-border transaction. I would only mention one player from Austria, which is Blue Code. And I should also point out that there was an impressive wave of mergers and acquisitions in this sector. All of you might be aware with MasterCard, Nets, Worldline, Ingenico, and all the others that were happening in the recent years. And finally, but not least, we note that all big tech companies have raised their interest in the payment business, and they step up their efforts in this area. Not only Facebook with Libra project, or recently Novi project, but also players which offer contactless solutions, such Apple and Google, have ever increasing presence on the European payment markets. And this is something that we're looking at with very much interest. Finally, allow me to mention a few words about the way forward in relation to the IFR and payment in this legislation and payment sector. If you can move to the next slide. I hope you can still hear me, and I would need to move to the next slide. Just to say a few words on the planning of the, well, there should have been a slide before that. Yes, here, thank you very much. I just want to highlight for you that the Commission is planning, it's organizing actually a stakeholder conference for December of this year, for 7th of December to be more precise. And the intention there is to collect a wide range of views from all stakeholders and market participants. As you all know, the Commission now closed its consultation on the retail payment strategy, but building on the received feedback from you, next steps will be announced shortly. Just to mention very briefly that the EIFR caps apply now also to inter-regional transactions, card transactions. These are transactions where basically it's the tourists coming in Europe and paying here to European merchants. The interchange fees would apply to these transactions as well. And this is due to Commission's competition enforcement actions that took place in the recent years. And finally, just a few words, just to highlight something that probably all of you are aware. The COVID crisis changed dramatically our payment behavior. These changes probably would last beyond the time when this crisis hopefully comes to an end. And I'm sure you will talk more about this in this conference. And let me conclude my presentation by saying that on the background of this, the future looks bright for cashless payments. So thank you very much for your attention. This is all I had to say, and I'm happy to pick up one or two questions if I'm able to hear them.